Welcome to Behind the Investigation with Atlanta News First Investigates. I'm Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe, and I'm joined now by investigative reporter Andy Perotti. Good to have you here, Andy.
Thanks for having me.
Now, today we're talking about an investigation that really wouldn't exist without your efforts. We're talking about those forever chemicals, PFAS, in drinking water. And you led this investigation when it was really just a small handful of people, and now we're testing a large group of people to see if they have this forever chemical in their blood.
Yeah, so it really started off with, like any good investigation, with a simple question. How were people impacted to exposure of a contamination that state regulators have known for quite some time, for years, in North Georgia? And a couple of years ago, I went up to our boss, our news director, and I said, hey, can I have about $1,000 to buy these blood tests? She said yes, thank goodness. And we tested 11 residents, and those test results revealed the majority of them had higher levels than the national median, and it led to Emory University taking action.
Before we listen to the piece and watch the piece, it's important to point out that these forever chemicals are known toxins, that they're labeled as carcinogens, cancer-causing chemicals, right?
Right. Almost all of us have some trace of PFAS in our blood because we're exposed to it and have been exposed to it for decades. It's in hundreds of products to make things stain and water resistant. So it's not surprising that these results will show some level of PFAS, but the higher the level, the more concerning it can be.
All right, let's listen.
Residents pulling up their sleeves,
I keep my fist balled up.
hoping their blood will reveal answers
Something right there.
about the potential impact of chemical exposure to their community.
If anything is wrong or if I have anything in my blood, I'd like to know it.
Their participation part of an exposure study that wrapped up this week in Rome and Calhoun, Georgia, testing nearly 200 people conducted by Emory University. Its goal to help measure the possible exposure from PFAS, a group of chemicals used by carpet manufacturers upriver for decades and discharged in public waterways used for drinking water.
Water is so essential. I just can't believe that it's happened.
According to the Environmental Protection Agency, the toxin is linked to cancer and other serious illnesses. It's used to make hundreds of products water and stain resistant, including carpet.
How are you today?
Sarah Malone is a recent breast cancer survivor. The longtime Rome resident doesn't know if PFAS contributed to her diagnoses, but hopes participating in the study will shed light on the contamination.
So I felt like maybe if I could help someone else with the study and find out a little more about maybe what was happening with me, then we could help somebody along the way.
Emory University's Dr. Dana Barr and Melanie Pearson helped lead this study.
Overall, this is not just a scientific study, right? We are being responsive to community concerns.
It's important for people to understand their exposure, so if there are health outcomes associated with it, their clinicians or their physicians would know that they need to monitor them more closely for certain health effects.
Emory's pilot study and direct response to an Atlanta News First investigation in 2023, which tested 11 residents for PFAS. Their results revealed nearly all of their blood samples contained higher levels than the national median. It's the first known attempt to measure the impact on people in North Georgia since state regulators discovered elevated levels of the toxin in waterways more than 8 years ago.
We swam in it, we fished in it.
Alvin Jackson's nearly 7 times the national median.
What does this lead to? What is it going to do to me?
This week, he got tested again, this time by Emory University.
Well, I think it's important. I mean, if this stuff has been around for this long, all my life, and I've got these high levels here, I think other people need to know that.
If we didn't do our analysis about a year and a half ago, would we be here today? Would you be here today?
We probably wouldn't know about it. Yeah, I mean, That was the first I had heard about the situation. People knew that there were chemicals in the water and they were concerned about it. So I think all of that collectively is what led us here. But yeah, I think that that was incredibly important what you did.
This up for me?
Residents anxious about what's potentially flowing through their veins and their rivers.
I'm also probably more scared of it, too, to see the results.
Thankful the scientists helping them get answers.
I'm curious, but I just am so grateful that you guys are interested in Rome.
Emory University says test participants could get their individual results in 3 to 4 months. It plans to release the overall results in about 9 months. It's important to note that this study will not look at health outcomes like whether exposure has led to an increase in cancer or other serious illnesses in the region. If you want to test your own blood for PFAS, we have information on how to do that in this story on AtlantaNewsFirst.com. Andy Parati, Atlanta News First, investigates.
Now, Andy, the testing has been done, again, thanks to your investigative reporting that led to this widespread testing in the Rome area. But how much longer are we going to have to wait to get the results to see if this is indeed a widespread problem?
Dr. Dana Barr, one of the lead scientists in this study at Emory University, says individuals who took part in this study, they could see their results in 3 to 4 months. The overall results, which they hope to publish for the public to see, is about 9 months. And then even after 9 months, it's going to be before, her peers in this industry, they're going to be looking over her work. So it's going to be quite some time until we see the complete picture, but 9 months, I think the public will have a pretty good understanding of the exposure up there.
Well, good on them for sharing those results first with the individuals who are volunteering to participate and who may indeed end up with higher levels, as you already saw in your own smaller sample. Another thing I wanted to ask you, though, is are those folks you've talked with, do they have some anxiety? In my family, we've had a lot of cancer, and whenever there's a scan, they call it scanxiety. You're waiting for those results to come back. Are they worried?
So we spoke to 3 participants, literally the last 3 people part of the study, and some of them expressed gratitude first that Emory University and Atlanta News First sort of led this and it's helping them to get answers, but some of them are anxious. They're curious. It's important to know, and I'm glad that you mentioned what you just said about people getting nervous about potential cancer screenings, that this study is not looking at health outcomes. It's not going to determine whether there has been an increase in cancer or other serious illnesses. They're just simply looking at the exposure level, and it's also not trying to identify the source of the contamination, although because of reports that have been done by state regulators, it seems pretty clear that most of the exposure here likely happened from drinking water.
Right, and there are many of these factories upriver, obviously. We're talking about, this is the Flint River, correct?
Flint River is actually way down south.
I'm sorry, that's my apologies.
Yeah, it's near, it starts in Dalton, Georgia, and so pretty much any waterway down is going to be potentially impacted by the carpet industry using this chemical for decades, and then the water treatment plants up there simply not having the capacity to take out the PFAS before putting it in their sewer systems and then putting it into the rivers.
Well, the thing about health outcomes is interesting because, that's the sort of old-fashioned way of looking for like a cancer cluster and then trying to find the source. This is the inverse of that, but it's also important to point out that the whole point of forever chemicals is that they're cumulative in your blood. So if you have a high level today, you could have a higher level tomorrow, and the actual net health effects may be years or decades down the road.
Yeah, a lot of people have told me over the years, because I've covered this issue now for 8 years, ever since state regulators identified elevated levels in the drinking water up there. And I've heard from so many residents saying, oh, my cousin, my uncle, had cancer. We've looked at the cancer rates up there. At the moment, it doesn't seem to be higher than maybe some other areas in the state. That's me doing preliminary analysis. I am not a scientist, nor do I play one on TV. But what researchers hope, though, is that there could be more testing to be done. So this was a relatively small pilot study. Only cost about $30,000, federally funded. But based on the results of this study, we could see more testing. I think Dr. Dana Barr, who you heard in the piece, she said she would love to potentially do more testing after the city constructs and builds its new water treatment plant, that is not even close to being finished. But what you would like to see is if levels have decreased after they've built that new water system years down the road.
Interesting. So the idea would be sort of taking a snapshot in time and then taking another one down the road and seeing if it's actually improved. Let's say, hypothetically, the results come back and mirror your findings. In that case, what would be the course of action, or is this just more of a surveillance issue?
So there are some things that people can do to better monitor their health if the levels are really high, if they well exceed the national median. And the National Institutes of Science folks, they've come up with a sort of comprehensive list, like if it's reached a certain point, a level, and I'm not going to try to remember what that number is because I don't want to get it wrong, but they recommend doing increased screenings for certain health risks like cancer, thyroid disease, things like that, versus people with relatively low levels. And again, all of us have PFAS, some sort of level in our blood where you take no action, maybe just monitoring it. It's really hard to monitor whether you believe it's increasing in your body or not because this test isn't readily available, but you can get it. At the moment, most insurance companies don't necessarily cover it. There's some pending legislation in Congress that would require the insurance companies to pay for it, mostly folks covered by Medicare, Medicaid. But you can purchase your own or try to find a lab that will test this, and so you can keep track of it if you believe you're in an area with high exposure risk.
You know, I've worked with you directly as a partner in our investigative team now for almost a decade. And the one thing I've always respected about your work, Andy, is that it isn't about sort of the bosses saying, hey, go do this story. Many of your stories are passion projects. You find these things, or at least you find the questions, and then you go hunting for the answer, but you're doing it, you know, sort of in this search for the truth. Is that what motivated you in this case to stay on it and to keep going, and while you're still on the story more than a year later?
You know, I think so. I think what really made me want to dive into this more is I felt that a lot of news organizations were reporting about this issue, but no one was really like asking the residents what they thought about this or how this impacted them. And I just thought it was a weird way to cover an issue because we were just covering, you know, the lawsuits. There's been a ton of lawsuits involving this. The city of Rome has filed lawsuits and settled with carpet manufacturers and chemical companies. But I kept wondering, aren't we talking to residents who live in this community? And so I think that's what sort of compelled me to look at this. But I also understand why maybe news organizations weren't really jumping on it like myself, because it appears to be such a huge glacial issue. And how do you solve such a huge issue when we know the contamination has been there for decades? But those are sometimes my favorite stories that I like to take on because they're often the ones that are ignored, or maybe people just, oh, it's too big, I don't want to take it on. But I think that's probably the main reason.
One thing I've learned about your reporting style and your investigative reporting style is you don't do stories about issues. You do stories about people and about the issues affecting them. This wasn't about PFAS. This was about the people, and it still is, and you're continuing to help them. Bravo. Andy Perotti, investigative reporter with Atlanta News First Investigates. You've been listening to and watching Behind the Investigation with Atlanta News First Investigates. You can watch us on Atlanta News First Plus or YouTube, and you can listen to this as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time.